Welcome back to Awakening Reformation, where Reformation awakens now. My name is Grant, and you do not see Erica, the weaker vessel, here with me. Like normal, what you see with me is a very special guest, is pastor, author, and most recently, Dr. Yuri Brito. Say hello, Dr. Brito.
Hey, everyone. Good to be with you, Grant.
If you guys want to get to know more about the network, Reform Rebel Network is on YouTube or your podcast feed, wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you subscribe. And on YouTube, hit that bell so you get notified whenever we have new content that comes out. And if you want to financially support the network, you can go to patreon.com/reformedrebel and you can support us there. We are in the middle of kind of an anticipatory build-up during Eastertide, called A Table in the Wilderness. And so each Monday we're putting out, it's a menu and a Sabbath or Lord's Day feast meditation for all of you that want to partake in that, just to kind of give you something to help fellowship and feast as we build anticipation to Easter. And so A Table in the Wilderness is going on. If you like it, please share it with your friends. And I'm going to try to get a PDF of that out for you guys so you can just download the whole thing rather than have to go back to the blog if you would prefer that. I think that's pretty much all the little admin notes I want to get to. I really want to get to the conversation with Pastor Yuri, Dr. Brito. How do you want me to refer to you in our conversation?
Listen, I feel like I already know you well enough. Just Yuri will be fine.
All right, fantastic. So, okay, Yuri, I want to let you... tell people who you are, a little bit about your background. I could have printed it out and read it myself, but I really want them to listen to you. So if you could please provide just a little bit of background information so people could get to know you a little bit.
Yeah, happy to, Grant. First of all, thanks for having me on your podcast. Really look forward to having this conversation with you. I was born in Brazil. I was the son of a Baptist minister and university professor. And I came to the United States in 1998 to pursue further education. And as I was pursuing further education, I ended up meeting an astoundingly beautiful and godly woman whom I married and persuaded to do life together with me with 5 covenant children. And God has been very good to me. I've been the senior pastor of Providence Church here in Pensacola since 2008. I'm in my 13th year as a senior pastor here. And I can honestly say that I have some of the kindest and most hospitable parishioners a pastor can ask for. Academically, as you just mentioned, I did my MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary. And after 5 long years, I've just defended successfully my doctoral thesis in pastoral theology from RTS.
Nice.
With my advisor, Dr. Michael Allen, and the friendship and support of my mentor, Dr. John Frame. So it's a long season that I've invested in this, and I'm really grateful to be done and begin sort of this new chapter in my life.
That's awesome. Was that at RTS Orlando, the PhD?
Correct. It's a doctorate of ministry, a D-Min, which is a little bit, it's longer than the PhD, but it's a more focused professional doctorate.
Right.
And it was in the Orlando campus, which we Orlando residents, we tend to say it's the God's preferred Orlando RTS campus, but others would disagree. But it was a wonderful time, Grant. When I was there doing my MDiv, I had what I refer to as the golden years of RTS. We had, Bruce Waltke, Roger Nicole, we had John Frame, Richard Pratt, Simon Kistemacher. R.C. Sproul had just left. It was just Palmer Robert. It was just a really blessed season. And I was just a very fortunate a student at the time and have gained tremendously through my seminary education, now my doctoral work.
Yeah, John, I mean, those are big names. John Frame alone, that guy, I don't know how he's written as many pages as he has, and just in such simplistic form too. I encourage people to get his systematic theology. I got mine right there. It's like a go-to. It's really,
yes,
it's awesome.
I second that, my brother.
So Pensacola and Orlando, this is a little funny anecdote about me. That's way back, I was in a band before Bible college. This is 2005, 2006. Pensacola was the first time I ever went to a beach and touched Gulf water. And the fact that it was like 90 degrees water like this. So I grew up in California where the
Yeah.
water is absolutely freezing. And
Yes.
I stepped foot in there and I was just, blown away at how warm it was, but it was awesome. And then Orlando, because of the other band we were on tour with, we got to stay the night at one of the members of NSYNC's house in
No way.
Orlando. So
Wow.
it was like,
I suspect that I need to do an interview on you. And I want to hear that background story. That sounds fascinating.
it was the NSYNC member no one knows about, Chris Kirkpatrick. Nobody knows who he is.
Okay.
But anyway, just one of those funny facts that no one really would believe you, but
Yeah.
it happened.
That's great. That's a great conversation starter at dinner
So
table.
funny. Yeah. So, all right. Well, part of why, other than being a part of the CREC, we were members of a CREC church in Brooklyn. And I think I've learned a ton from a lot of people that I believe have mentored you. And we'll get into some of that, I think. But you run a website and a podcast called Kuyperian Commentary. In the last few years, I've become a huge fan of Abraham Kuyper. And so, learning about you and your ministry and then seeing that, I was obviously drawn to it. Could you share a little bit about what that is, what the ministry of it is, how it got started, and share a little bit?
Absolutely. Kuyperian commentary was a project that I had in mind back in 2007, I believe. And the two principles that I had in mind when I began that website was I had two central presuppositions, Grant.
Okay.
The first one was that Christians are worshiping beings. They're homo adorans. They're worshiping beings.
Mm-hmm.
And the second one is that we believed that Christ was the head of the church and the head of the state and the head of the family.
Mm.
And we believed that the family was in disarray, that the church was in disarray, and the government, well, that's redundant. And so the government had grown to an uncontrollable size.
Mm-hmm.
It had abandoned what we consider here in the United States, abandoned its constitutional roots. But most importantly, it had forsaken the Lord of the country, who is Jesus Christ. And so with those two central premises, I thought to myself, I really believe that something out there ought to reflect those ideas. There are a lot of websites dedicated to political,
Mm-hmm.
Politics in general, but very few. I'm not aware of any. I think that connect the idea of a Christian as a worshiping being, but also one under submission to the lordship of Jesus as he relates to the church, the family, and the state. And so that's where I wanted to begin the conversation. And as I began with a desire to advocate these two principles, I realized that it's very hard to party on your own.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I did is I started inviting people to join the conversation with me. And so at this point, we're 2021, we have around 21 writers. Nice. And a few published works. And so there's a rotation of writing that goes on, and certain seasons have a more significant input of articles and things like that. But we have been steady along, whereas all our other folks who have begun the same season that we did have kind of stepped aside or no longer functioning. We have kept our rhythm for over a decade now, and we're really grateful for the ministry of Kuyperian. And one of the benefits of it is that I know my desire was that whatever we write would benefit the church at large. And it's always encouraging to hear churches, men's studies, ladies' studies using our articles for all sorts of purposes, for Bible studies, for reflection, for exhortations, for devotionals.
That's great.
And so that has kept the momentum going because I see the fruit of it in the church, and that has kept me from ending the project altogether and has motivated me to continue for the last 10 years.
Well, and even to keep it alive during doctoral work, that couldn't have been easy.
Yeah, that was a challenge, and thankfully the other guys kind of picked up on my slack. Nice. And were gracious enough to fill in with some wisdom.
So as I've listened to you on other podcasts and even on the Kuyperian Commentary podcast, you mentioned being mentored by James B. Jordan, and just learning a ton from him. You can talk a little bit about your history being mentored by him if you want to, but I would like to know if Jordan's influence led to the beginning of Kuyperian Commentary. Was his mentorship of you part of what led you to starting Kuyperian commentary?
Well, that's a great question. I don't think I've pondered that question, but if I consider Jim's influence in my life, I think he inspired me to do just about everything I've done since I first met him. I mean, it's a very comprehensive sort of way of looking at life. So Dr. James B. Jordan has become this larger than life figure. But I first met him when I finished my MDiv and I was hired here in Pensacola. And as I arrived, I realized that he was a part of the congregation. Uh-huh. Our congregation had hired him to be our pianist and our Sunday school teacher. So I inherited the brilliance of Jim Jordan. And Grant, I got to tell you, man, it was those first few sermons were absolutely terrifying to have him sitting in the front row. Our church was really small at that time, so it wasn't hard to see where he was. Yeah. So we spent a lot of time together in those first 3 years. We probably had 100 meals together on the Lord's Day. And we spent time preparing for conferences together. I don't know if you're familiar with the famous or infamous Biblical Horizons Conference that I had the chance to organize and participate and spoke at. That's great. So in some ways, I've told people a lot when they ask me, oh, so you were James Jordan's pastor. Well, in many ways, Jim Jordan was my pastor because I felt like I received another seminary education under JBJ. And what was different about what Jim offered was that Jim was looking at the world as a fountain of symbols. That's how I phrase it. And what I mean by that is that Jim argued that he argued against a kind of hermeneutic, against the prevailing hermeneutic of the day, which for Jim was this kind of Greek approach to life where meaning and symbols are man-made. They're manufactured by men. And so he believed that affects every kind of interpretation we have of the Bible and of culture. So if our modern tendency is to look at the text and see things, if we look at the text and we see mountains and we see stars and skies and food and drink, and if we just assume, oh, these are just brute ideas and objects with no greater meaning, they're just raw identifying markers that the Bible gives us. Well, Jim said that's just rubbish. And what he said was that we're not the ones who fabricate meaning, that God is the one who gives inherent meaning to the text. And so this entire perspective, of course, when you look at it, it just affects the way you look at the entire world. Mm-hmm. If we live in a static cosmos, then God is sort of practically transcendent only. He's not immanent. He's not near. And what's going to happen is that God is going to present the text, his revelation, in a raw fashion. And that means that we as image bearers are going to be incapable of drawing the greater and the more profound meaning that God has for us. We're going to stick with, and you see this, Grant, even in sort of modern commentaries, we're going to stick with very superficial meaning. Yeah. We're going to miss very significant details. Well, Jim turns this entire endeavor upside down, and he says that when revelation is given to us, that it's very specific, that the Spirit of God doesn't waste his breath when he inspires his words, right? That he creates us to look at symbols, and he creates us as reflectors of a God who gave us the world as a symbol. Yeah. And the more we learn about God and his word, the more we're going to see God's text generating more and more beauty, so that there will never be a time in the history when we're going to say we've exhausted the Bible. Yeah. So we look at mountains in Isaiah and we say, well, these are the places of gathering between man and God. We look at the seas in the Bible, we're going to say, this is a representation of the Gentiles. We're going to look at rocks in the Bible and we're going to say, this speaks of the ultimate triumph of the great head crusher, Jesus Christ. We're going to look at colors in the priest's attire. We're going to say, this takes us back to the beauty of the tabernacle. And so, well, we looked at Kuyperian and we said, we're going to take this approach. And when our writers focus on their articles, on their culture articles, whatever kind of article it may be, we're going to look at what's happening in politics. We're going to ask ourselves, what's behind such and such an action? We're going to look at movies and then we're going to ask, why are this is a question my children always pick up. Why are ungodly directors so enamored by layers of meaning and symbolic actions?
Yeah.
And the answer is because we're image bearers and we are unmistakably
Right.
symbol generators when we submit to the God who creates the world as a symbol for us. So Kuyperian is, I call it a combination of cultural interest with the symbolic glory that Jesus gives in his revelation. And I really hope that as the years go by, we who, as Paul says, we judge angels,
Yeah.
that we're also able to look at the Bible and say that our final judgment of the Bible is that God has given us a book that is filled with glory and beauty, and we can never cease to harvest that glory and that beauty.
Yeah. And that was awesome. And the little bit that I have learned of Jordan in just probably the last couple years, I've only had about 2 years of exposure to this, but my wife and I, she, her and I are both reading his stuff and listening to the stuff Theophilus puts out with his old lectures. And then just recently, Word MP3 did a sale on his whole collection.
Yeah.
And I got that. I was like, I can't pass this
Fabulous.
up. So that thumb drive is in the mail somewhere. But I cannot wait to get those old Biblical Horizon Conference talks and listen to that stuff. But one thing we kept talking about was when you do look at the world, they're great with symbology. When it comes to logos and flags and lyrics and songs and stuff like that, they're great at it, and the church has totally ditched it. And
yeah,
we were being helped so much by what Jordan taught in that way of symbology, and we just realized that the church needs that really bad, because that's part of why they lose the culture war in a lot of ways, is not realizing the power of symbology, and that the world is knocking it out of the park most of the time when it comes to that slang language. They're the ones that come up with slang that mean all these things that hit deeper than just regular, I don't know, dry language. But
yeah, absolutely. And what this does, Grant, just as a follow-up to what you said, which is really, really profound, really, what it does is it makes you as a human being a better interpreter of reality. So, and that means that people who are invested in this kind of hermeneutic will stand out in whatever environment they're in, secular or Christian.
Yeah,
will be able to offer a perspective and angle that people are just not familiar with. And it's going to bring more depth to, really everything. It's going to bring more depth to conversations around cigar and whiskey, and conversations around the dinner table with wife and children.
Yeah.
And I think you'll never be able to watch Star Wars the same way again.
That's so good. Part of linking Jordan with Kuyper for me is, I remember listening to some Q&A he did. It was actually with Peter Lightheart and Doug Wilson. It was something Canon Press put out. Super old, really bad audio quality, but they put it up anyway. It was a great conversation. And I had listened to Kuyper's lectures on Calvinism, and that helped me a lot. And then that was kind of as far as in the Dutch Reformed way of thinking I got. And then Jordan said, we've kind of abandoned all these men, Kuyper and Dooyeweerd and Vollenhoven, and these guys who were writing massive books on a whole world and life view. And all these names I just started writing down, and I just realized that Jordan. So Jordan's, I blame him for all of my, and Van Brimmer. I'm Dutch anyway. So you mentioned reading a Dutch person who's good. I'm gonna jump on that one. So
yeah.
So I definitely see Jordan coming in the wake, at least, of what Kuyper maybe began, or took Calvin, where Calvin couldn't totally flesh it out, and they were still barely coming out of during the Reformation, but being able to work over that world and life view. But
yeah, exactly. No, Jim is what would happen if Kuyper and Van Til came together and had a baby. You get James B. Jordan.
So
because
good.
you get the profound culture insight of Kuyper, who and you get the Van Tilian no nonsense And when you combine those, you get this really profound way of looking at everything. And I have the privilege of working with Greg Strawbridge at Word MP3.
Mm-hmm.
And the material that has changed the lives of most people is almost always James B. Jordan. And Grant, I mean, I spent 3 years with the man, and I've spoken a lot about him. This is one of the most humble, awkward human beings you'll ever meet. The kind of man that you just see and you just want to give him a big hug. There's no pretensions. There's no pride. He's just a very humble man who has served the church faithfully. And he's at a stage in life right now. He's had some severe health problems, but I really pray God gives him many more years to bless the church in whatever way possible.
Yeah, I listened to something recently, and there was a baby in the class talking and yapping and stuff, and he stopped his lecture, and he knew the kid's name. I can't remember. I'll just say it's Grant. And he was like, Grant, would you be quiet over there? And like just kind of joking with the little kid. And like 10 seconds later, I guess the mom was about to take the kid out, and he goes, "Oh, you don't got to take him out. That's fine. I'm used to people talking back to me, or little kids talking back to me, or something like that."
Well, listen, all those lectures, the vast majority of them were done in our congregation.
Were they? Okay.
And so there's a high likelihood that might have been one of my children. And so
that's awesome.
God, he was a dear saint personally, and it was a real blessing to be with him in those early years.
So you spoke a little bit about why you did start the Kuyperian commentary, but go a little bit deeper about why it's important for the church right now to carry on the legacy of Kuyper. What's so important about emphasizing that today?
Well, the beauty of Kuyper is that Kuyper is, in its broad sense, Kuyperianism in its broad sense, essentially means that the Christian should always have an insatiable desire to make Christ known. And there's going to be different approaches to a figure that was so prominent, as you know, in the Netherlands. But our desire at Kuyperian is sort of to continue that general vision of Kuyper in his very explicit application of Jesus' lordship over everything. And so our website does have a more general focus on application, because Kuyper was a very revolutionary figure. In fact, if you look, Grant, at Calvinistic figures in the days of Kuyper, they had a tendency towards pietism.
Yep.
And pietism in some ways is just a way of taking the Christian faith and privatizing it and devotionalizing. That's how I like to phrase it. But Kuyper offered something very unique to the Calvinistic worldview that I think deserves a first, second, third hearing from a modern culture. And our modern culture, and I know you agree with this, has become sort of myopic in the application of the Christian faith.
Yeah.
Very much like in the days of Kuyper. So Kuyper has the ability, the one reason we need to continue the legacy of Kuyper is because he has the ability to stir Christians who have in many ways embraced sort of this distaste for Christendom. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And Kuyper's writings, his thinking, his commitment to this concept of antithesis, I think it's absolutely fundamental to approaching the culture's compromise on everything these days. So if you were to ask me the same question 15, 20 years ago, I would have said probably something a little different. But today, when the lines are so clearly and objectively drawn, when secular culture is so explicit about their hatred of Christ, when wokeism, I call it mother woke, when a lot of Christians are eager to sort of lay at the bosom of mother woke, we have now sort of an opportunity to present a very concrete and distinct vision. And I think Kuyperianism sort of fits that profile. And that's why I think that legacy has to continue today. And it's the kind of legacy that says there's no neutrality, and here are 100 reasons why.
That's awesome. So many people are being bombarded with the question about church and state relations right now. We are in a global pandemic, and it's being we're being led by government leaders differently in many different parts of the states. Up here in Canada, it's obviously much more heavy-handed, and but it's causing Christians to actually think this through again. Does the state have any jurisdiction over the church? If so, how far? What can they touch? What can't they touch or shouldn't? Regulative principle of of Scripture in that realm or that sphere. How is Kuyper helpful in this area?
Yeah, that's a very significant question if we're going to continue the legacy of Kuyper. And I think first and foremost, Kuyper develops this in the concept, the phrase of sphere sovereignty.
Mm-hmm.
And for Kuyper, that meant that there are spheres of influence in any society or any civilization that demand a, a kind of independence. So that, let's take the three main spheres here. There's a fourth one that Rushdoony said, which would be the self. Let's take just the Kuyperian spheres of family, church, and state. When the state, and this, so I'm obviously preaching the choir here, but when the state interferes on how a family ought to educate their children, or in this COVID madness, when the state interferes in how church ought to structure their liturgy, thou shalt not sing openly, but must be sung. You must sing through a veil. When the church interferes with the liturgical structure, when the state interferes in the liturgical structure of the church, what we have here is a crossover that ought not to be. That God essentially structures certain institutions to function independently of one another. There ought to be a mutual encouragement so that each sphere can function more effectively.
Right.
In other words, the state ought to protect the function of the church and the role of the church, as the church ought to protect and encourage the role of the biological family.
Mm-hmm.
But when one begins to impose regulations on the other, what we're seeing here is a violation of Kuyper's sphere of sovereignty here. And for Kuyper, there were two classes of human beings. There were those who were subject to revelation,
Mm-hmm.
and then the rest.
Right.
And the revelation for Kuyper is obviously the word of God, and especially faith in Jesus Christ as Lord.
Mm-hmm.
And that authority is a delegated role from God. A man has a particular role as a husband, as a father. A man has a particular role as a parishioner or as a pastor. And a man has a particular role as a politician or a head of state. And again, there's mutual encouragement, but when the violation of sphere sovereignty, which is happening consistently,
Mm-hmm.
and it has become sort of a virus among human beings,
Sure.
right? They all think this is how things ought to be, and it's become the modern sickness.
Yeah.
When that happens, and then we need a proper reorientation of a Kuyperian viewpoint, and that's what we try to do. That's what I try to do as a husband, as a pastor, and I'm
Mm-hmm.
sure it's the same thing what you try to do where you are.
Right.
But we have obviously violated that principle, and when that happens, even an inch of violation can lead to severe repercussions. And we're not at an inch, my brother. We're at 1,000 miles of violation.
Yeah,
And that's the necessity of continuing the Kuyperian vision of sphere sovereignty.
Another thing that I read recently that I found really helpful was one of the chapters in John Murray's I think it's volume 1 of his collected works. He has a chapter on state and church relationship, and just very clearly he just says one is not above the other. They are equal, and they have designated limits by God, though, and that the church's job is to teach the state, though, what it is that the Bible lays out for them. Not that they are in charge or above them, but that the church's job is to inform, preach, teach what their limits are. And I see so many big Eva Christians, or just kind of the run-of-the-mill nominal Christians, who are saying that the church needs to stop talking politics and stop talking into the culture and stop doing this sort of thing. And I think John Murray and Kuyper are super helpful in that, and it just, you can't find that in the words of Scripture either, but that tendency is there. So as Kuyper was definitely involved with culture, preaching to the culture, reforming culture. We're post-millennial. We want God's glory to cover the entire earth as the waters cover the sea. But I have noticed that if I look up people who follow Kuyper, there does seem to be some who embrace his ideologies, and it seems they drift to more of a social gospel uh, tendency. Do you see that too? And what would be helpful in keeping us from drifting in that direction? Like thinking social action is really what's more important rather than what the church is doing or what doctrinal beliefs and the type of gospel you're preaching and that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think I think the people you're describing do exist. A lot of them live somewhere around where you live over there, and they're there. And I think the initial motivation sometimes can be very positive, right? But I think Kuyperians, we can be very susceptible to modern trends like the social gospel, or at least we can be tempted to apply a generic gospel a generic gospel to areas when what we need is a very objective gospel.
Hmm.
So Kuyperianism goes astray when it looks at the gospel with generic terms. And so, for instance, we know that culture is not the domain of pluralism. We can't have unhindered pluralism.
Right.
Christians, Trinitarian Christians ought to be the shapers and framers of culture. But when we allow the vision of Kuyper, which he refers to as common grace, and this is the kind of language that people use from Kuyper, common grace, which means that God gives rain to the just and the unjust, borrowing from the language of the gospel. The argument essentially is that everything is good as long as it carries, this is the argument from what I refer to Kuyperian pluralist. The argument's good as long as it carries some kind of Christian sentiment. So if you want to use the Sunday morning service to display Christian art or Christian concerts or something that's not regulated by the Bible, but it's done in the name of common grace. And so that perspective says that we're doing the good, we're doing the beautiful. But I think what we've seen, and I know you've seen as well, the trend is that no, it leads to some very dangerous paths. And I think the trend I see is that those claiming the heritage of Kuyper, let's just say hypothetically in a seminary named Calvin, hypothetically, those claiming the name of Kuyper, they can easily deviate from the centrality of the text in favor of general principles of the good. And so that's the danger. When you deviate from the centrality of the Bible in favor of principles for the good in the name of common grace, that's when you begin to distance yourself from, I think, the heart of Kuyperianism. And you begin to distance yourself. And as I said earlier, if you distance yourself an inch from the text, you run the danger of compromising the very gospel that you promote. So here, not too far from here, about 6 hours from Pensacola in the Tennessee area there was a congregation in Nashville that several years ago began to allow homosexual as into membership.
Okay.
Practicing homosexuals to membership LGBT in the name of the common good.
Wow. And
as of just last week, they came out with a different document, and it was separated in two columns, Grant. The one said something like the Bible is not the word of God. And in the other column, it said the Bible is a community text.
Whoa.
The other one said the Bible is not inerrant. The Bible is a text that benefits the social conversations of the day. And it was a kind of subtle contrast.
Yeah.
Unless you have grown up unless you're aware of Kuyperianism and that kind of John Murray sort of conversation, you realize these are not subtle. This is what Machen said. This is Christianity and liberalism, and one is true and the other one is idolatrous. And so that's, I think, in the name of Kuyperianism, in the name of artistic expression, in the name of gifts, however you want to phrase it, that deviation from the centrality of the Bible, guiding and regulating the activity of the church, that's when Kuyperianism goes wild.
Yeah, it seems like a move towards autonomy from God's.
Yes.
It's just I would prefer to be in charge, because with a loose definition of what the scripture is with that, you end up being the one that can kind of interpret it and make it up for yourself. If it's just the scripture benefits whatever. Well, you can decide what benefit that is. Well, it's not benefiting me. It's telling me to stop sinning. So I don't like that part of
Exactly.
it.
Exactly. No, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
um, so, man, we probably go on and on and on. This is great. Um, I want to ask you though, where would you point people to, other than KuyperianCommentary.com and the podcast, to learn more about Kuyper himself? What would you point people towards?
Well, thanks for asking this question here. We live in really, really exciting times for Kuyper studies, and I've been getting more interviews on Abraham Kuyper because of the sort of the renewal in Kuyper studies.
Mm-hmm.
Lexham Press, and I would pull out several books they have sent me, but they're stuck among other books,
Yeah.
and
I
can't
have
reach them right
volume.
now.
I think I have volume 1 here. One sec.
Okay, go for it.
This guy. Is this what you're talking
That's the
about?
one.
Sorry, I know
That's the
on
one. And I have
selfie
the
camera it's backwards, everybody, but here's volume. Yep, volume 1. There's gonna be you talk about it, not me.
no, I have all of them here, and
Oh,
there's more
fantastic.
works to be done. Kuyper was so prolific,
Yep.
and as that copy right there, Lexham Press is good plug for Lexham Press. They do very good work. Is republishing all of Kuyper's works in beautiful formatting,
Yeah, it's
and
great.
I'm the kind of guy who gets a book from from some publisher, and I want to see how the font looks like, how readable it is. Lexham Press has done a great job, and you can read Kuyper on every single issue he's dealt with. You can read Kuyper on the church, education, common grace, even on Islam.
Yeah.
You can read here. There's a devotional one called "Honey from the Rock," which is
Hmm.
Kuyper's devotions. And of course, you will want to read, as you mentioned earlier, everyone who says, "Who in the world is this Abraham Kuyper that these dudes are talking about here?" Everyone needs to read Lectures on Calvinism
Mm-hmm.
because it's his distillation of the best way to live out the Calvinistic vision
Yeah.
of the sovereignty of Christ over everything. In fact, by the way, another plug here. One of our writers, Jesse Sumter,
Mm-hmm.
published a book on summarizing the main arguments of Lectures on Calvinism,
Perfect.
and I can send you a link to that if you would like.
Sure.
And it's
Yeah.
a really helpful commentary and synopsis of the book. So go there. And even though one more thing, even though it's a life altering book, no doubt. It's a little bit
Definitely.
archaic in some ways, but the content is very
Yeah,
rich.
it is.
And even though those lectures were delivered in Princeton in 1898, I think, what they do when you go back and read it, they are incredibly prophetic,
Yes.
detailing how the so-called experts of the day have claimed the position of power outside their domain. So prophetic in detailing how scientism has become kind of its own religion.
Yeah.
Anyway, Lectures on Calvinism, and I would take advantage of the Kuyper revolution, and we are doing our best, Grant, to make Kuyper great again, my man.
That's awesome. Yeah, and I may put it in the show notes too, but there's a website I found when I first went to want to read this, just Googling it. But there's a church in Washington or something, uh,
Mm-hmm.
at Trinity Evangel.com or something. Anyway, I'll put the link in there. But you can get the PDF free because that's public domain. The PDF's free. And then also, I don't know if it's the pastor or somebody, um, they have the audiobook. So each lecture, there's an audio of each lecture. So if you're
Ah,
more of an audiobook person, you can download all the files or listen to it right there on the website if you prefer audio. And that's how I listened to it the first time I read through it, was just audio. And it's good. Totally
that's fantastic. That's
awesome.
great.
Yeah, and then I highly recommend this. I think it's the first 3 volumes of this set is pro reggae, so for the king, living under Christ's kingship. And you're right, he touches on every area of life. It's really
Mm-hmm.
awesome. Um, well, I want to let you plug whatever you want to plug, or just have the last word here before I end the show.
Well, thanks, my man. I just happen to be selling this beautiful coffee mug here for 27 euros. So if you're interested, Grant, here it is for the public. We'll make it available, link later on. But
Beautiful.
more importantly, I would be really grateful if you folks could go to Kuyperian.com. And it's a little complicated to spell. It's a new word for a lot of people, but it's KUYPERIAN.com. And that's where I do that's where all the brouhaha happens. And I have a personal blog also called YuriBrito.com. And you can go there for more devotional material and some just meanderings about all sorts of topics. I also have a new newsletter, and I can make that available. I can send you where to subscribe.
Yeah.
Called the Perspectivalist, and that's where I'll begin to write a little bit about articles related to counseling. I'm a certified counselor, but also articles related to pastoral theology, where I just got my doctoral degree, and theology proper. And so that will be going out maybe twice a month, and I will be happy to send you a link to subscribe to the new newsletter.
That's awesome. I know everyone watching, listening, Yuri also co-wrote is it Ruth commentary? And that's the Through New Eyes commentary series is great. It's not overly technical, but it's very biblical and kind of adopts the Jordan hermeneutic of being able to see the symbolism and the Bible as a whole, at least. So I would encourage people to buy that.
Thanks for plugging that. I would love to have a few additional buyers beyond my mother and my brother. That would be fantastic. The book is it's the commentary series overall is fantastic. And Rich Lusk, the two of us, we have a Jonah commentary that will be sent to the editors, the powers that be at Athanasius in about a month from now. And hopefully we'll have the Jonah commentary published by the end of the summer through Athanasius Press as an additional commentary in that wonderful series called Through New Eyes.
Awesome. Wonderful. Thank you, Yuri, so much for coming on. And I hope all of you enjoyed the conversation. I hope it built up your appetite to go learn about Kuyper and all those who came in his wake. James Jordan, even Doyeverd, although that is some muddy, that's some trudging waters you got to walk through there. But still helpful with thinking, with worldview thinking, honestly. So I hope you guys really benefited from this conversation. Be immovable, be steadfast, always abounding in the work of the Lord, knowing that your labor is not in vain. Until next time.